Hello, I'm Stan Copeland, and I love it when the kids here at our church, Lover's Lane, call me Pastor Stan. I want to introduce you to our new YouTube channel that's on the Picklin Parson brand, and it will feature different categories. We'll have some videos that will be from the canner, from the cookbook, from the farm, and from the pulpit. So I'd like to ask you to like these videos if you like them, and be sure and subscribe to this YouTube channel. You know, I was thinking about how much of my time over the past 24 years that I've been the pastor here, I have spent preparing messages or sermons. And those sermons I create weekly, and sometimes I deliver them 2 times, 3 times, sometimes even 4 times on a Sunday morning. And so I thought maybe there's an excerpt from those sermons, just a few minutes of a piece of the sermon that I call the Yeah, that might be something that would be uplifting and my way to share goodness with you. So I'm asking you to subscribe, and if you like it, then ask your friends to subscribe as well, and we'll keep these videos coming to you. You know, every year I think of him. I can't help it. I've even shared this story with you. His name was Mr. Easter. Now that's a funny name to be talking about at Christmas, right? Mr. Easter. His name was really Easter Naren, but we always just called him Mr. Easter. And Mr. Easter was one of the kindest, gentlest men I've ever met. And he was part of my childhood. He was really kind of my babysitter. Actually, his wife was the one who was employed to be the babysitter. Mr. Easter was a night watchman. And when he'd get home early in the morning, he'd take a nap so that he could be ready to help Mrs. Naren babysit me, because I was a handful. Now, my sister, no problem. But Mr. Easter had to come in as the reinforcements. This was in the 1960s. I was a little boy, but I loved it when Mr. Easter would finally get to the house, because it was time for the fun to begin, and it did. He wore this little Stetson hat, kind of like an LBJ hat, little short brim. It wasn't nearly as stately as the signature hat of LBJ, but it was a little worn and tattered. But I never saw Mr. Easter without that hat, ever. In fact, I imagine him in his pajamas going to bed with that hat on. He'd come over, and there'd be the hat, and we'd go fishing in the Kickapoo Creek for the goggle eye with, a cane pole and a worm on the end. And, he loved to take me fishing. And we'd play baseball. No baseball caps for Mr. Easter. It was catch and pitch with that Stetson hat on. And then, of course, whether it was playing football in the yard or hide and seek, there would Mr. Easter be with that hat. And I thought about his look. I'm going to try to describe it to you. He was a kind of a tall man. He had tanned skin, and he had wrinkles on his face. He was an older man when he was my babysitter, and those wrinkles were deep, and his features were large. He had big ears and a big nose, and he had a big heart. It all went together. But his hands, I remember, were huge. I mean huge. And I watched his hands a lot. He had big fingers, and his fingernails were bigger than my whole hand, it seemed like. And he smoked Raleigh cigarettes, so his fingers on his right hand were a little bit yellowed. That always intrigued me. I remember I admired so much the way he played the guitar. And sometimes he'd play and sing. He had a Kalamazoo guitar that was a dark-colored guitar. And I remember when I was 8 years old, I was looking in the Ward's catalog, Montgomery Ward's catalog. Anybody remember? The Sears catalog. You remember? Yeah, they'd be that big, right? And you'd look through them and you'd find it. And I wanted a guitar that year. And I bought a little guitar. It was dark brown, just like Mr. Easter's. I didn't know how to play it. But Mom decided that she'd pay Mr. Easter $1 to teach me to play the guitar on Saturdays. Now, I don't know if it was worth $1 for Mr. Easter to have babysat me through the week and then have me on Saturdays for a guitar lesson. But I remember I'd take my little guitar and I'd sit across from Mr. Easter. Oh, we didn't have chord books or anything fancy or sophisticated. Mr. Easter could sing and play country music. And I'd just sit across from him and I'd watch his fingers. He'd say, well, if you can't make a G like that, make it like that. And a C and a D. And you just watch what I'm doing. You put your fingers where I'm putting my fingers, and I'll sing these songs and you can play along with me. You know, Mr. Easter, he kind of had a sad countenance most of the time. You know, I've been told, I don't know if it's the truth, but I was told that his first wife and daughter were killed in a car wreck. And that his heart was broken and never really mended. But when he picked up that guitar, he was transformed. It was almost as if in his mind's eye he was on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry. And there I was, getting to accompany him. Now, I don't know, but I do remember how that sad countenance was transformed into one of happiness and joy. I remember the first Christmas after I'd been taking guitar lessons from Mr. Easter for nearly a year. I said, Mr. Easter, why don't you teach me a Christmas song? And he kind of looked a bit puzzled. Mr. Easter wasn't a church-going man. And that made him a little different in my hometown because everybody went to church in my hometown, but not Mr. Easter. Maybe he was still working through some of that heartache and pain, and maybe he didn't know exactly where God was in the midst of all of that. I don't know. But when I asked him to teach me a Christmas song, he looked a bit puzzled. And then he said, I've got it. I've got just the one. And you know, a lot of Mr. Easter songs weren't really fit for church, and this one barely is. I can see him now. Just because you think you're so pretty, just because you think you're so hot, just because you think you got something that nobody else has got, just because you spend all my money, you laughed and called me old Santa Claus. Well, I'm telling you, honey, I'm through with you because, just because. Yeehaw! I think he said yeehaw because he thought he'd really rang the bell with that Christmas song. And you know, in hindsight, I don't know why in the world he thought that was a Christmas song, except for the part about old Santa Claus. I looked as puzzled as he did when he got through. Oh, he was yeehawing, and I was still waiting for a Christmas song. And so I said, Mr. Easter, I mean, can you teach me a Christmas song like we'd sing in church? He looked puzzled again. He said, well, what do you want to play and sing? I said, well, something like Silent Night. And he said, okay, I'll play it. You sing it. So in my boyish tenor voice, I tried to remember it. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright, round yon virgin, mother and child, holy infant, so tender and mild, sleep in heavenly peace, sleep in heavenly peace. That's all I remembered. But when I looked at Mr. Easter, he had this tear roll out of his eye and get caught up in one of those crevices on his face and roll all the way down to the tip of his chin. You know, I wondered if he wasn't thinking about that heartache and a God who wanted to love him and wanted him to have peace. Christmas is the story of God's love, and God's love heals broken hearts.